What would you do if the man who promised to love you forever walked out on your 40th wedding anniversary? He did this without a word of warning and left you standing in a home you built together, while his much younger girlfriend picked out new curtains in your living room. 40 years of marriage, 3 grown children, a beautiful house tucked in a quiet neighborhood where we had built everything together: memories, traditions, and trust. But I was wrong, because the man I gave my youth, my heart, and my entire adult life to left me on our anniversary for her. And what followed wasn't just betrayal, it was humiliation, rage, and eventually something far more powerful: redemption. This isn't a sob story. You're about to hear how I transformed devastation into quiet revenge. So stay with me, because this isn't just about what he did. It's about what I did after. And trust me, you won't see it coming. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments what you would have done if you were me. Because by the time this story ends, you just might rethink everything you thought you knew about heartbreak, healing, and a woman's worth. The roses were fake this year. I stood in the kitchen, staring at them like they might explain something, anything. Plastic stems, velvet petals, a manufactured scent that tried too hard to be romantic. He had left them on the counter, next to the coffee maker I used every morning for 40 years. No card, no note, just the sad imitation of love and silence. 40 years, 40 anniversaries. And this one was the first I'd ever spent alone. I didn't cry at first. I just stood there, motionless, the morning light slanting through the window, casting long shadows over the tiled floor where we once danced barefoot after dinner. I remember the year he bought me real roses, fresh, full, fragrant. They arrived early with breakfast in bed. That was our 15th anniversary. He kissed my forehead, said he'd never love another woman the way he loved me. And maybe that was true, because I don't think he's capable of love anymore. By the time I heard his car pulling out of the driveway that morning, the house had already swallowed me in silence. He didn't say goodbye, didn't mention dinner reservations, didn't bring up our plans because, of course, there were none. Just a hurried, muffled phone call behind the bathroom door at 6:45 a.m., and then the sound of keys, footsteps, and the front door clicking shut. That was it. That's how a man leaves after 4 decades. Not with a scream, not with a fight, but with silence, with fake roses, with a void so wide I could barely breathe through it. I spent the morning in a daze. I washed dishes that didn't need washing. I opened the fridge 3 times and forgot what I was looking for. I wandered from room to room like a ghost, haunted by the very life I had built. There was the sofa he picked out when we remodeled the living room. Something neutral, he said. There was the photo of our family trip to Rome, still on the mantel. There was the faint indent in the pillow where his head had rested the night before. All of it normal, all of it wrong. By noon, I sat down at the kitchen table, the fake roses staring at me like a cruel joke. And I realized something. He had planned this. The indifference, the withdrawal, the business trips that grew longer, the secretive texts, the cold shoulder at dinner, the way he started double-checking his phone after every conversation. It didn't just happen. He was easing out of our life like a man sneaking out the back door of a party he no longer enjoyed. And he chose today, our anniversary, to disappear. That was the part I couldn't forgive. Not the affair. Not even the betrayal. It was the timing, the cruelty of it, the quiet brutality of making me wake up and realize I had no one to celebrate with. Just plastic flowers and 40 years of memories that now felt counterfeit. So I did something I hadn't done in years. I stopped pretending. I stopped making excuses for him. I stopped trying to fix something that had been broken longer than I was willing to admit. I picked up my phone and opened his most recent texts. I don't know why I hadn't done it sooner. Maybe I didn't want to know. Maybe I was afraid the truth would confirm what I already suspected. But the truth didn't wait for permission. There she was. Brielle. The name alone made my stomach twist. Not because she was younger. Not because she was the affair. But because she was so casual. Her last message was just 3 words. See you tonight. No shame. No secrecy. Just confidence. She thought she had already won. And maybe she had. Maybe she'd taken him from me. But what she didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that the house she was about to play homemaker in, it didn't belong to him. It belonged to me. And I was about to make sure she decorated it beautifully, just in time to watch someone else move in. Let the games begin. I stared at the screen, that kiss emoji burning into my vision like an open wound I hadn't realized was bleeding. See you tonight. Not happy anniversary. Not even a fake apology or a coward's excuse. Just those 3 smug little words from a woman I'd never met, but somehow already hated with every fiber of my being. I set the phone down slowly, as if it might explode. And maybe it already had. Not in sound or fury, but in the quiet, cruel unraveling of a life I thought was still mine. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I didn't even cry. Because something inside me had clicked, like a gear that had sat rusted and forgotten for years, now grinding back to life. It was strange, the clarity. The betrayal didn't break me the way I expected. Instead, it sobered me, woke me up, like cold water thrown in my face after decades of sleepwalking. I had been living inside a marriage that had stopped being real a long time ago. The signs had been there, etched into the silence, folded into the awkward conversations, buried beneath his late nights at the office and work retreats that always seemed to land over birthdays, holidays, anniversaries. This hadn't happened overnight. It had been a slow disintegration, one he masked with small kindnesses and routine, enough to keep me hopeful, just enough to keep me quiet. But I wasn't quiet anymore. I sat at that kitchen table with the fake roses and the cold coffee, and I made a decision, not out of spite, not even out of rage, but out of something deeper, out of justice, out of survival. If he was willing to discard our marriage like yesterday's mail, then I was no longer obligated to keep his secrets. I didn't owe him my silence. I didn't owe Brielle anything either. Let her think she'd won. Let her believe this house was her new kingdom, and he was the king handing her the keys. Because what neither of them knew was that the deed to this castle was in my name. I had protected myself years ago after one of his early indiscretions. A fling he swore meant nothing. A mistake that nearly tore us apart back then. We never told the kids. We buried it. We went to therapy. And then I did what any woman who learns not to trust does. I made sure the house was transferred into my name during the refinance. He had agreed, stupidly, casually, like it didn't matter. But now it mattered. Oh, it mattered more than either of them would ever expect. I stood up from the table with a calm that surprised even me. I wasn't going to confront him, not yet. Not in some dramatic shouting match where he'd twist things and make me feel like the villain for snooping, for reading his texts, for not trusting him. I didn't need his words. I had his actions. And I had my plan. I walked upstairs, into our bedroom. Well, my bedroom now, and opened the closet. There were still traces of him everywhere. His shirts, the cologne I used to love on his skin, his cufflinks in the drawer beside mine. I looked at them all like you look at artifacts from a civilization that no longer exists. It was over. I knew it now, fully, and without a shred of doubt. But I wasn't going to just walk away. I was going to watch. I was going to smile. I was going to let her decorate the home she thought she was stealing from me. I was going to let her waltz in, measure drapes, pick out throw pillows, choose candles for the guest bathroom. I was going to nod and agree, and even help her if she asked. And then, when everything was just how she liked it, when the rooms were curated for her vision of domestic bliss, I was going to sell it. Gone. Just like he was. Let her stage her dream. Let him think he'd landed on his feet. They had no idea the ground beneath them was already shifting. And I was the one pulling the rug out from under it all. The next morning, I didn't sleep in. I didn't wallow. I didn't stare at the ceiling replaying the same pain. I got up before the sun and poured myself a cup of coffee in the same kitchen where the fake roses still sat, stiff, emotionless, unbothered. A perfect metaphor for the man who left them. I didn't move them. Not yet. I wanted to see them. I needed to. They reminded me of who I used to be. The woman who would have clung to those flowers. Who would have convinced herself they meant something. Who would have twisted her own heart into knots to justify why her husband walked out without a kiss, without a word, on their 40th anniversary. But I wasn't her anymore. I took my coffee to the back patio and watched the light spill across the garden we planted together the first summer we moved in. Back when we still laughed at stupid things and touched each other like we were afraid of losing it all. I remember the way he used to pull me close after long days, his hands warm and calloused, his eyes soft and sincere. I believed in those eyes once. But belief is a dangerous thing when it's built on lies. And now, I was done believing in a man who had spent years pretending to love me while building an escape route with someone half my age. I was done making excuses for a husband who could walk out on me with the casual confidence of someone who thought he was irreplaceable. Because the truth was, he wasn't. By mid-morning, I had already pulled out the realtor's card from the drawer. Jennifer Walters. I'd met her at a charity gala 2 years ago. We clicked instantly. She had a way of making people feel seen. I remembered she told me back then, "If you ever want to sell, Marianne, call me. No pressure. Just promise me I'll be the first to know." Well, Jennifer was about to get her call. I dialed her number with shaking fingers, not from fear, but from the electric buzz of clarity. This was happening. I wasn't thinking about it anymore. I was doing it. When she answered, her voice was bright, curious. "Marianne? How are you?" I almost laughed. How was I? I was devastated. I was furious. I was also more alive than I had felt in years. "I want to sell the house," I said, calm, measured. Quietly, discreetly, but quickly. She hesitated just a beat, probably sensing the shift in my voice, the storm behind my composure. "Of course," she said. "Are you sure?" "Yes," I replied, without a flicker of doubt. "I'm sure." We set a meeting for the next day. It felt surreal, how easily it all moved forward after that. One phone call and the wheels were already turning. My house, our house, the one with the memories etched into every wall and floorboard, was now a transaction in motion. And I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel sad. Not even a little. I felt ready. And as if the universe wanted to test just how ready I really was, that afternoon, Brielle showed up. I heard her before I saw her, heels clicking confidently on the porch, followed by the too loud knock of someone who believes they belong. I opened the door, and there she was. Long blonde waves, oversized sunglasses, lips too red for a casual Tuesday. "Oh, hi," she chirped. "David told me I could stop by and start measuring for curtains." I stared at her. Not a trace of shame in her voice. Not an ounce of apology in her eyes. Just the easy confidence of a woman who thought she'd won a prize, not realizing the box was already empty. I smiled. Software sweet. Controlled. Of course, I said. Come right in. She breezed past me, clipboard in hand, already rattling off design ideas like she was the new lady of the manor. Paint swatches, pillows. This room just screams for a makeover, she said, laughing lightly. And I nodded. I encouraged her. I even offered her a tape measure from the junk drawer. Because I wanted her to fall in love with every corner. I wanted her to see it all as hers. She had no idea the paperwork was already in motion. That the home she was fantasizing about was slipping right through her manicured fingers. Let her decorate. Let her dream. I was going to sell the fantasy she thought she owned. And I was going to do it with a smile. She moved through my house like she already owned it. Brielle's heels clicked across the hardwood like a metronome of entitlement. Every few steps, she'd pause and gesture toward a corner, a window, a wall, as if she were curating a gallery instead of parading through the ruins of my marriage. This would be such a great space for a reading nook, she said, tracing her fingers along the frame of the bay window. And oh, imagine some ivory Roman shades right here. Something soft and elegant. I nodded like I was taking notes. Inside, I was screaming. But I didn't let it show. I was past anger, past shock. I was somewhere quieter now, somewhere colder. A place where the pain didn't burn anymore. It just hummed under the surface, sharp and steady. I let her talk, let her sketch, let her hold up fabric swatches, and ask my opinion as though we were two friends sipping wine and designing a future. As if she hadn't slept with my husband. As if she hadn't walked, uninvited, into a life I spent 4 decades building. It was surreal, watching her claim a space I hadn't even had time to mourn. She admired the coffered ceiling David and I had picked out together in our 30s, called the kitchen charming in a rustic way, and suggested repainting the dining room to brighten the energy. She even dared to touch the crystal chandelier, the one my mother left me, the one David said we should display prominently because it made the house feel like home. Now it just felt like a stage. And Brielle? She was rearranging the props. I think I'll swap out the fixtures too, she said, smiling brightly. Gold is having a moment again, don't you think? I could feel something deep in my chest shift, a slow roll of thunder behind my ribs. But I kept my voice steady. Whatever makes you feel at home, I said. She beamed, oblivious. Thank you, Marianne. I really appreciate you being so open-minded. I know this must be strange. Strange. That's what she called it. Not cruel, not disrespectful, not nauseating. Just strange. Like I had accidentally stumbled into her story. And maybe that's what she believed. Maybe David had fed her some carefully curated version of our marriage, told her it had been dead for years, that I was cold, distant, detached. The classic lies, the coward's gospel. Easy to believe when you're desperate to be someone's fresh start. But I wasn't the one who was distant. I was the one who stayed. The one who endured the quiet winters of our marriage, the long silences, the canceled plans, the disapproving looks over my aging skin. I was the one who kept showing up, folding his shirts, cooking his meals, holding his hand at funerals and weddings, and every empty space in between. And now I was the one opening the door to a woman who thought she had earned something. Brielle walked into the master bedroom like she was trying it on for size. Do you think this space could fit a California king? She asked, turning to me with innocent curiosity. David prefers the extra legroom. My throat tightened, but I didn't flinch. Probably, I said. I watched her circle the room, talking about bedding and wallpaper and minimalist art. She didn't ask me to leave. She didn't seem to realize, or care, that this was where I once brought my babies into the world, where I sat up late during fevers and nightmares and storms, where David once held me after my father died, rubbing circles into my back like he could hold my grief at bay. This was the room where I lost my youth and found my womanhood. And now, here she was, pacing the floor in designer flats, planning how to make it hers. Let her. Let her paint the walls and hang her photos and fill the drawers with her perfume. Let her build her castle. Because when the papers went through, she'd be decorating a stranger's home. Not David's, not hers, and certainly not mine. She just didn't know it yet. But she would. Very soon. By the time Brielle left that afternoon, the house didn't feel like mine anymore. And maybe that was the point. She floated out the door with her mood board tucked under one arm and her phone already dialing someone named Alex to discuss throw pillows. She didn't even glance back. No thanks, no small talk. Just a final swipe of her red lipstick across the reflection in my hallway mirror, and a parting comment about how she couldn't wait to see it all come together. Neither could I. After she left, the silence returned. Not the peaceful kind, the hollow, echoing kind that presses against your chest and makes even your own breathing sound like an intrusion. I stood in the foyer for a long time, one hand on the banister, staring at the light fixture she had said she wanted to replace. It was antique. David's mother's, actually. I used to hate it. Now I wanted to enshrine it. Not because I cared about the fixture, but because it was mine to lose. Every inch of that house had been touched by my hands. The wallpaper in the upstairs hallway I hung myself while David was out of town. The chipped tile near the back door from when our youngest dropped a pan, and we never fixed it because we said it added character. The handprints on the garage wall we marked in cement when the twins turned 7. And she wanted to paint over all of it. Replace it. Modernize it. Polish it until it gleamed like it had never belonged to anyone before her. I walked through the rooms after she left, slower than usual. Not to remember, but to say goodbye. Each step felt ceremonial, like I was sweeping through a mausoleum, laying flowers on the grave of a life that no longer breathed. I ended up in the kitchen again. Of course I did. The roses were still there, unmoved, unapologetic. I picked them up for the first time, felt the weight of their artificial stems, the sharp plastic edges beneath the petals. A lie disguised as a gesture, a performance in place of presence. And suddenly, I laughed. Really laughed. The kind of laugh that catches in your throat like a sob, but escapes anyway because if you don't let it out, it will rot inside you. I laughed because it was all so ridiculous, so predictable, so cowardly. David had walked out on our anniversary with fake flowers and an even faker future waiting in the wings. And he thought he could hand her my house like it was a consolation prize. He thought I would crumble. And maybe I would have, a long time ago. Maybe there was a version of me who would have begged, pleaded, clung to the doorframe as he left. But that woman was gone now. She had left with the last real bouquet of roses he ever gave me. The new me? She was a little quieter, a little colder, but infinitely more dangerous. I poured myself a glass of wine, sat at the kitchen table, and opened my laptop. The email from Jennifer, my realtor, had already come through. She had a few potential buyers. One had seen the photos online and was asking to tour as soon as possible. Another was a young woman with a daughter, recently divorced. She wanted to buy a home with character. A fresh start. I smiled. That's what this house deserved. A woman rebuilding, not one pretending. I clicked, reply. Let's show it this week, I typed. Wednesday afternoon is perfect. I hit send. And then I picked up my wine, raised the glass slightly to the empty kitchen, to the fake roses, to the ghost of the woman I used to be. To reinvention, I whispered. They could play house a little longer. Brielle could redecorate to her heart's content. She could fall in love with the lighting, the layout, the promise of it all. But soon, I'd be handing over the keys, and not to her. Wednesday came faster than I expected. The house was spotless, almost unnervingly so. Every pillow fluffed, every mirror polished, every countertop gleaming with a level of perfection that felt ironic, considering how broken everything beneath it truly was. If someone had walked in that morning without knowing the truth, they would have seen a home carefully maintained by a woman in control of her life. And in a way, they would have been right. But control doesn't come from spotless countertops or the scent of lemon polish lingering in the air. Control comes from decisions, quiet ones, ruthless ones, the kind you don't announce but feel in your bones, the kind that turn pain into strategy and betrayal into blueprint. I lit a candle in the foyer. Jasmine and sandalwood. Brielle had suggested vanilla, said it was inviting, but I had always hated the way it clung to the air like desperation. Jasmine was sharper, less sweet, more honest. The doorbell rang at 2:01 p.m. I opened it to find Jennifer standing there in her slate gray blazer, her hair pulled back in that effortless way women like her always seem to manage. Behind her stood a woman, early 30s maybe, with tired eyes and a cautious smile. A little girl clung to her leg, maybe 6 years old, her eyes wide as they took in the high ceilings and curved staircase. "This is Elise and her daughter Maddie," Jennifer said. "They're very interested in the property." I smiled and stepped aside. "Come in, please." They entered with reverence, like the house had whispered something sacred to them before the threshold had even been crossed. Maddie's fingers slipped from her mother's leg and reached out to graze the banister. I remembered my own children doing that once, sliding down it in socked feet, squealing as I pretended to scold them. "This place," Elise said, her voice low. "It just feels full of life." I swallowed hard and nodded. It was. Jennifer guided them through the tour like a conductor, highlighting the vaulted ceilings, the custom cabinetry, the sunroom that bathed in light around 3 p.m. every day. I stayed a step behind, silent, watching as Elise's eyes lingered on the things that mattered. The old doorknobs, the imperfect floorboards, the places where a story had already begun. When we reached the master bedroom, Elise hesitated in the doorway. "It's beautiful," she said. "You can tell this room held something, like it remembers." I looked at her for a long second. She didn't know what I'd lost in that room. The dreams I'd buried, the years I'd given, the lies I'd eventually uncovered. And yet somehow she saw it. Not the specifics, but the ache, the residue. "I hope," I said quietly, "that it remembers you better." By the time they left, Elise had asked about the timeline, the paperwork, the neighborhood schools. She didn't say she wanted it. She didn't need to. I could tell by the way she looked at the house, the way I used to look at it, before I learned that love can rot beneath hardwood floors and slip behind paint and plaster. After they left, I sat back down in the kitchen and stared at the roses. Still fake, still perfect, still lying. Jennifer called an hour later. "She's making an offer," she said, voice tinged with quiet excitement. "Full asking, wants to move quickly." She said something about finally feeling at home. I closed my eyes, felt a lump rise in my throat, but not sadness, not regret, gratitude, not for David. God, not for David, for the clarity, for the end, for the promise of handing something broken to someone ready to make it whole. That night, David called. I let it ring. Then I watched it go to voicemail, while I sat in the silence of the home he thought he'd handed off to someone else. The irony was almost poetic. Brielle was still planning the paint colors, but Elise was already on the paperwork. Brielle came by the next morning, wearing a linen jumpsuit and that smile women wear when they think they've won. She brought a color wheel and a little bag of swatches tucked neatly into her tote. She was humming when she stepped inside, walking through the foyer like it was already hers, like her name was engraved in the walls. She didn't notice the slight change in my expression, or the way my fingers curled a little tighter around my coffee mug when she asked, "Do you think Dove Gray or Cream would make the entryway feel more open?" I answered her questions with a calm I hadn't earned, at least not yet. But it was coming. The reward of silence, the power of patience, the knowing that when you stop reacting, you start controlling. She talked about fixtures next, pointing at the overhead light above the staircase. "I've been looking online," she said. "David's letting me handle the redesign. He said he trusts my style. Isn't that sweet?" It was meant to provoke, a test, a jab. She wanted to see me flinch, cry, snap. But I didn't. I just smiled, took a slow sip, and said, "Oh, that's nice." Because I had already scheduled the movers. I had already signed the papers. And in less than 24 hours, someone else would be holding the keys to the house she thought she'd conquered. Let her decorate it. Let her pour herself into it. Let her think that putting her signature scent into the drawers and her throw pillows on the couch made it hers. She had no idea I'd already cleared out the safe, already emptied the joint account, already made arrangements for every box, every frame, every piece of a life she'd never be invited to understand. She moved room to room that morning, placing sticky notes on the walls. Accent wall here, new shelves here, replace knobs. Her voice floated behind me as I walked slowly toward the dining room, the one we used for every Christmas dinner, every birthday, every tearful conversation where we promised to try harder next year. She wanted to turn it into a flex space. God help her. By late afternoon, the stage was set. Literally. Jennifer had called to confirm that Elise had finalized the funds. The wire transfer was processing. The closing was scheduled for the next morning. Elise and her daughter would be taking possession by the weekend. The house was no longer mine, and it had never, truly, been theirs. I stood in the doorway of the living room as Brielle bent over her phone, showing me mood board options for rugs. "Something earthy," she said, "but modern. You know what I mean?" I didn't answer. I was too busy remembering the night David and I slept on that floor with our newborn son, because the crib hadn't arrived yet, and the bed was too far away. We laid him between us, scared to fall asleep in case he stopped breathing. We took turns watching him breathe. Now that floor was for her coffee table. "How soon do you think the painter can come?" she asked. "I'd love to get started this weekend." My lips parted in the softest smile. "I wouldn't rush it," I said. "Oh," she chirped. "David said we could." I cut her off with a gentle shake of my head. Things change. There was a silence between us then, just a sliver, just enough to make her blink. That night, I set the table one last time. Candles, cloth napkins, a bottle of wine we'd been saving since our 25th anniversary. It had dust on it now, like the love we used to toast with. I didn't text David to invite him. I didn't need to, because he showed up anyway, just like I knew he would. I opened the door, let him in, and watched the confusion flicker across his face as he took in the candles, the wine, the good china. "I thought you'd be angry," he said cautiously, loosening his tie. I just smiled and gestured to the chair. "Sit." He did. And Brielle? She arrived 10 minutes later. Perfect timing. They were both seated when I made the toast. "To new beginnings," I said softly, and neither of them saw it coming. Tomorrow, the house would be gone. and so would they. They sat at the dinner table like it was any other evening, like it hadn't been months since we'd all shared a room, let alone a meal. Like the foundation beneath them wasn't about to crack so loudly it would echo through every smug thought they ever whispered behind my back. David reached for the wine I had already poured, his hand steady, his smile tight, polished. It was his public face, the one he used when clients came over, or when someone on the street asked about our perfect marriage. He used to reserve it for strangers. Now he used it on me. Across from him, Brielle twirled her fork in her salad, blissfully unaware that she was starring in a play with no idea the final act had already been written. The table was immaculate. Candles flickered. The wine breathed. The mood was, at least to them, perfectly civilized. And that was exactly what I wanted. "This is lovely," Brielle said, lifting her glass. "It means so much that you're willing to be so open-minded." Her words dripped with entitlement, coated in that thin layer of faux gratitude women use when they think they've risen above the woman they replaced. She looked at me with wide, glossy eyes, like she genuinely believed this was a new chapter we were all writing together. I raised my glass too, slow and deliberate. To new beginnings. David didn't say much. He never did when he felt something slipping out of his grip. I could see it in the way he kept glancing around, eyes darting toward the hallway, the cabinets, the walls, as if sensing something was different, but not knowing what. Because it was different. He just didn't know it wasn't his anymore. Brielle went on and on about ideas for the house, her house, in her mind. She wanted to knock out a wall. She wanted to add French doors. She even mentioned building a greenhouse in the backyard because plants are healing. I smiled, nodding along, even offering ideas. "That sounds beautiful. You should definitely do it." Her face lit up like a child being praised for drawing inside the lines. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. The plates were cleared. Dessert was offered, store-bought tiramisu, but I'd plated it neatly, like it belonged. Everything tonight was a performance, and I was center stage, wearing a dress I hadn't touched in years. Deep navy silk, form-fitting. David had once said it was too bold for a dinner party. Tonight it felt like armor. When Brielle got up to take a call, some nonsense about granite countertops, I turned to David, leaned in slightly, and rested my elbows on the table like we were conspiring. "What's this all for, really?" I asked quietly. He blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" "This dinner, the performances, the pretending." He glanced toward the kitchen, as if worried Brielle might return. "I just thought it would be nice. For closure. For civility." Civility. That word hit like a knife with a velvet handle. He had no idea what closure looked like. Not yet. So I stood. Walked over to the buffet table where a manila folder sat neatly beneath a linen runner. I picked it up, walked back, and placed it in front of him. His brow furrowed. He opened it. The color drained from his face. Inside were the sale papers. The house. Closed. Finalized. Transferred. Effective at noon the next day. To Elise. His voice caught. "You sold the house?" "I did," I said, my tone smooth and calm, like I was commenting on the weather. "You always said I was good at paperwork." "But Brielle?" He turned, desperate, flustered now. I shrugged. "She wanted dove gray walls. I let her pick them. Didn't see the point in stopping her." He looked up at me, eyes wide, mouth hanging open with half-formed objections. I tilted my head, offering the softest smile I could muster. I figured if she loved the space so much, she should make it beautiful, just in time for the new owner. He didn't speak. He couldn't. And when Brielle walked back in, oblivious, still talking about backsplash tiles, I knew it would hit her next. They thought I was decorating the stage for their story, but I was preparing it for their exit. And tomorrow, the curtain would fall. The next morning, the sun rose with the kind of defiance that felt personal. It lit every corner of the house as if to expose what had been hidden. Dust in the corners, scratches on the hardwood, memories clinging to walls like old wallpaper, impossible to peel without leaving something behind. I stood in the doorway of what used to be our bedroom and let the light hit my face. It was a strange kind of warmth, not comforting, not nostalgic, just final. David hadn't slept there the night before. After dinner, after the silence settled in and the documents sat between us like a freshly dug grave, he left without another word. He didn't argue. He didn't try to fix it. He didn't even try to blame me. I think somewhere inside him, he knew he had no claim to this place anymore. Not the house, and not the woman who had once called him home. I poured my coffee slowly, like it was the last one I'd ever have in this kitchen. In a way, it was. Not because I couldn't have coffee elsewhere, but because this space had always been mine in the most invisible ways. My mornings, my rituals, my quiet. And soon, it would belong to someone else. Not David, not Brielle, but someone who had earned it through survival, not seduction. The movers came right at 10. A small crew, efficient, professional. I had labeled everything, every box sealed and marked with neat handwriting. Things I would take, things I would leave, things I would never look at again. I stood back as they carried out decades of my life in cardboard and tape, and not once did I feel the urge to stop them. Brielle arrived around 11, earlier than expected. She wasn't smiling this time. Her heels hit the pavement with sharp, uneven steps. She looked smaller somehow, less polished. Her eyes darted around as she approached the house, confusion growing with every step. She must have noticed the moving truck, the open door, the way the rooms echoed now. When she stepped into the foyer, she froze. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice high and thin. I didn't answer right away. I let her take it in, the bare walls, the missing furniture, the absence of her future. "I thought we were painting this weekend," she said, almost to herself. I turned to her slowly, coffee still warm in my hand. "The house sold." Her head jerked toward me. "What?" "I sold it. The papers were signed days ago. The new owner gets the keys in about..." I glanced at the clock on the wall. 40 minutes. She blinked rapidly, as if trying to rewrite reality by sheer force of will. "David said, he said this was ours, that you were okay with everything." "I never said that," I replied calmly. "You just assumed." She opened her mouth to argue, to protest, to plead, but nothing came out. Just the widening of her eyes, the slow crumbling of a fantasy she thought was hers to keep. She stepped forward like she might try to push past me. "I spent weeks planning everything. I picked paint colors. I picked furniture." I nodded. "I know. You did a great job. I'm sure Elise will appreciate it." "Elise?" "The buyer." She stared at me, lips parting, then closing again. I could see the cracks forming now, the slow dawning of betrayal not from me, but from the man she thought she had won. Because he hadn't told her. He hadn't warned her. He had let her build her dream inside a house he no longer owned, with a woman he had underestimated from the very beginning. The front door opened behind us. Jennifer stepped in, holding a manila envelope and wearing her usual calm smile. "All ready?" I nodded. "Yes. Perfect timing." Jennifer glanced at Brielle, then back at me, a flicker of understanding passing between us. As we stepped outside to meet Elise and hand over the keys, I didn't look back. Not at Brielle. Not at the house. Not at the life that had collapsed behind me. Because I wasn't the woman who waited for apologies anymore. I was the one who signed the papers. The one who handed over the keys. The one who left before the ruins could bury her. And I was finally free. The keys felt lighter in my hand than I ever remembered. Maybe because they no longer carried the weight of illusion. They weren't symbols of love, or legacy, or the life I once thought was eternal. They were just metal now. Cold, neutral, honest. And for the first time in years, I wasn't clinging to them like they meant safety. Jennifer handed me the final envelope, the one with the closing documents, the check, the release forms. It was done. Final. Irrevocable. I turned just slightly, enough to glimpse Brielle still frozen in the doorway, staring into the hollowed-out shell of a house she thought she was going to fill with new memories. She didn't speak again. She didn't plead. She just watched, arms hanging by her sides, lips parted, eyes vacant. Maybe she was realizing it now, that this house had never really been hers to begin with. I stepped forward, met Elise on the sidewalk, and placed the keys in her hand. There was something sacred about that moment. Two women exchanging more than a house. We were passing on survival, resilience, proof that what falls apart doesn't have to take you with it. Elise's eyes met mine, and she didn't have to say anything. I saw it all in her face. Thank you. I understand. Me too. And then I walked away. Not in a rush. Not as an escape. But with a steady grace that only comes after choosing yourself for the first time in decades. The car was already packed. The movers would deliver the rest to the temporary condo I'd rented downtown. A small, quiet space overlooking the river. Nothing extravagant, but clean and full of light. I hadn't told anyone where I was going. Not even the kids. I needed time to breathe in my own name again, without being someone's mother, someone's wife, someone's placeholder for stability. As I drove, I didn't play music. I didn't call a friend. I just let the silence fill the car like a kind of baptism. My thoughts drifted, not to David or Brielle, but to the version of myself I had so carefully buried over the years. The woman who used to paint for hours before dinner. The woman who laughed too loudly at old movies and snuck chocolate into her pillowcase on long nights. The woman who once dreamed of opening a bookstore by the coast. Not because it would make money, but because it would make her happy. I had forgotten her. I had silenced her. I had traded her in for something I thought was safer. But safety is a funny thing. It fools you into thinking comfort is the same as peace. And it's not. Comfort can be a cage if you're not careful. If you ignore the signs. If you pretend the cracks in your life are just shadows instead of wounds. I parked by the river before heading to the condo. I needed a minute. The water moved slow, almost lazily. A few ducks floated by, unbothered by the storm someone else might be carrying. I sat on the bench and let the wind touch my face. I didn't feel angry anymore. Or betrayed. Or even victorious. I felt empty. But in a good way. A quiet way. Like a house that had finally been cleared out. Ready for something new. David texted me an hour later. Just 3 words. "Where are you?" I stared at the screen. I could feel the desperation wrapped in those words, the unraveling beginning to catch up with him. He thought I'd always be there. Thought I'd linger like a habit too familiar to quit. He never imagined I'd leave before he asked me to. That I'd close the chapter myself. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. This wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about justice anymore. It was about finally stepping out of the narrative I didn't write. The one where I was always the giver, the forgiver, the fixer. I was done fixing. The condo was waiting, bare walls, a new bed, a view of the river where the sun hit just right around 6 p.m. It wasn't home. Not yet. But it was mine. And that was enough. The condo smelled like fresh paint and nothing else. No trace of perfume on the pillows. No lingering scent of aftershave in the bathroom. No ghost of someone else's voice echoing down the hallway. Just silence, and not the suffocating kind I used to dread. This silence felt pure, liberating, like a blank canvas. I stood in the doorway for a moment, not moving, just breathing, listening, feeling the way the stillness wrapped around me without pressing in. There were no memories here, no shadows clinging to the corners, no laughter that turned brittle, no slammed doors that left dents in my heart. Just walls, windows, and air that didn't ask anything of me. I had never lived alone before. 40 years. 40 years of being a wife, a mother, a fixture in someone else's life. I couldn't remember the last time I chose furniture based on what I liked, cooked a meal just for myself, or sat in silence without anticipating someone else's needs. And now I was here. Not in a palace, not in a dream, but in a space that didn't demand anything from me except presence. I dropped my keys in the small bowl by the entryway. It was the first thing I'd bought for the place. Simple, handmade, etched with small cracks in the glaze, imperfect and beautiful, just like me. I made tea, slowly, without urgency. No clattering pots, no second mug, no one asking if there was toast. Just steam curling from a cup and the quiet hum of a city I hadn't yet decided to fall in love with. I carried the cup to the window and sat on the floor, legs tucked beneath me. The river gleamed below, catching the last light of the day. It looked nothing like the view from our old house, with its manicured lawn and trimmed hedges and pretentious fountain that never worked right. This view was raw, real. Cars moved below like lifelines. People walked without glancing up. Life didn't stop here. It surged forward, unapologetically. I sipped my tea and felt the first tear slide down my cheek. Not from sadness. Not anymore. It was grief, yes, but of a different kind. Grieving the woman I had been. The years I had lost. The parts of myself I had dimmed so someone else could shine. It was a farewell, not to David, but to the version of me that let herself become invisible in the name of love. I didn't regret the life I'd had. I wouldn't lie and say it was all bad. There were good moments, real ones. Moments where David held my hand during hard times, where the kids filled the house with noise and chaos and laughter, where I felt like I belonged. But over time, those moments became relics. Shards of a life I kept trying to piece together even as it crumbled. And still, I stayed. I stayed because that's what women like me were taught to do. We don't leave. We don't quit. We fix. We endure. We bury our anger beneath dinner plans and PTA meetings and long nights waiting for someone to come home, not just physically, but emotionally. But I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for David. Not for Brielle. Not for an apology that would never come. I was done waiting to be chosen. I was choosing myself. And it wasn't glamorous, this beginning. It wasn't the montage you see in movies, where the scorned woman cuts her hair, runs down the beach, and falls into the arms of someone new. It was slow, quiet, painful in the places you don't expect. Like when I opened the cabinet and reached for a second cup out of habit. Or when I woke in the middle of the night and instinctively reached for a body that wasn't there anymore. But each time, I reminded myself, this is healing. This is what it looks like to rebuild. Not to start over, but to start true. If you're still here, thank you. This part was the hardest to tell. The phone buzzed once, then again. I didn't check it. I didn't need to know. Whether it was David or one of the kids asking questions, it could wait. For the first time in my life, I wasn't rushing to explain myself. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and leaned into the window. Outside, the river moved without hesitation, without memory. It didn't care where it had been. It only cared where it was going. And so did I. Morning came in slow, silver waves through the floor-to-ceiling windows, bathing everything in the kind of light that doesn't ask for permission. It just arrives. Like truth. Like closure. Like the moment you finally exhale after holding your breath for years without realizing it. I lay there for a long time, wrapped in the softest sheets I had ever bought for myself. Not for a guest room. Not to impress anyone. Not to match a color scheme David insisted on. Just because they felt good against my skin. And because they were mine. The stillness in the room wasn't lonely. It was honest. There were no footsteps in the hallway. No shuffling outside the door. No murmured conversations, or someone else's alarm clock going off 2 rooms away. Just the quiet thrum of a world that no longer expected me to be anyone but myself. I pulled on a sweater and walked barefoot to the kitchen. The floor was cool beneath my feet, grounding. The tile wasn't expensive. The cabinets weren't custom. But everything inside that little space belonged to me. Every mug, every spoon, every choice. No one had picked them for me. No one had criticized them. And for the first time in 4 decades, I didn't need anyone's approval before deciding what color the plates should be. I made coffee. Slowly. Deliberately. No need for extra cups. No expectation of conversation. I didn't need to fill the air with noise to feel real. The silence was more than enough. There's something sacred about reclaiming the ordinary. The small things. The rituals. I hadn't realized how much I'd sacrificed the mundane in the name of stability. How often I had skipped over my own joy just to keep peace, to keep the routine moving, to keep David comfortable. But I wasn't in the business of comfort anymore. Not for anyone else, at least. The phone buzzed again while I poured the coffee. David's name flashed across the screen like a wound reopening. I stared at it, the way you might stare at a spider in the corner of the room, annoyed, unafraid, unwilling to let it ruin your morning. I let it ring, then silenced it. I didn't owe him answers anymore. Let him sit with the consequences. Let him explain to Brielle why the walls she picked paint for were now someone else's to decorate. Let him realize that the woman he thought he could betray quietly had learned how to roar in silence. Later that afternoon, I ventured out for groceries. Nothing dramatic, just essentials. Things I liked. No list dictated by another person's preferences. I paused in the produce aisle longer than I needed to, just enjoying the feeling of not rushing, not worrying about who was waiting in the car, not bracing for a sigh when I picked the wrong kind of apples. It sounds stupid, I know, apples. But when you've lived your life trying not to inconvenience anyone, even your own fruit becomes a compromise. At the checkout, the cashier smiled and said, "New to the area?" I smiled back, and something in me ached at the simplicity of the question. I almost wanted to explain, tell her about the house, about the betrayal, about the woman who'd traced her finger over my wallpaper while planning her future in my bed. But I didn't. I just nodded and said, "Yeah." Starting over. She bagged my groceries slowly, with care, and I felt that lump again in my throat. It had nothing to do with pain. It was something else. Hope. A quiet, trembling kind of hope that wraps itself around your ribs and whispers, "You're going to be okay." Not right away, but eventually. Back at the condo, I unpacked everything and arranged the kitchen with more thought than I ever had in my old life. There was no one to impress, no one to tiptoe around. Just me. And that was enough. That night, I lit a candle by the window. The same jasmine and sandalwood scent I had used that day, Brielle walked through my house with a smile and a dream she didn't earn. The scent didn't sting anymore. It felt like a goodbye letter I had finally mailed. One she would never read. One that didn't need to be read. The days began to blend together in the most unexpected, quiet way, not out of numbness or sadness, but peace. A kind of stillness I hadn't known in decades. It wasn't boring. It wasn't lonely. It was spacious. And I had never realized how much I needed space until I had it. I had stopped waiting for the shoe to drop, because it already had. And I was still standing. My phone still buzzed from time to time. David's name would appear once or twice a week, sometimes more, always with the same desperate rhythm. One-word texts. Please. Talk? Lunch? They came like ripples from a man who hadn't figured out yet that I was no longer floating in his tide. I didn't respond. Not because I wanted to punish him, but because I finally understood what silence could be. Not avoidance, but a boundary. A declaration. A steady, still refusal to re-enter a storm just because someone else was drenched in it. I had spent too many years running toward other people's messes, trying to fix what I never broke. Not anymore. One afternoon, I went walking by the river. The sky was soft with clouds, and the wind carried that pre-rain tension, the kind that makes the world feel like it's holding its breath. I liked it. It matched something inside me. Not anxious, just aware. As I passed a row of benches, I saw a familiar figure sitting on one. Paul. I hadn't expected to see him there. We hadn't spoken since the house sold. He had been David's friend once, long ago, back when we were all younger, when loyalty was assumed and betrayals still seemed like something that happened to other people. He had always been kind to me, quiet in his presence, gentle in his questions. I remembered that. I remembered how he looked at me without pity when I told him what happened. I could have kept walking, but something in me stopped. Maybe it was the way he looked out at the water like he was waiting to let go of something too. Hey, I said, my voice low, careful. He turned, startled for a split second, then softened. Hey, Marianne. It was strange, hearing my name from someone who had never used it to hurt me. There was no bitterness, no history he was trying to rewrite in his favor. Just a recognition. A seeing. I sat beside him. The silence between us wasn't heavy. It felt like a blanket. The kind you pull over yourself on a cool evening, not because you're cold, but because it feels good to be held in something soft. How are you? He asked eventually. I thought for a moment. I'm okay, I said honestly. Better than I thought I'd be. He nodded, not pressing, just listening. We talked for a while, nothing dramatic, nothing forced. Just the ease of two people who understood how painful it is to be left behind and how miraculous it is to choose yourself anyway. He didn't ask about David. I didn't ask about his past. It wasn't necessary. We were two people on the other side of wreckage, sharing a quiet bench by the river, like survivors who had nothing left to prove. When I stood to leave, he touched my arm gently. If you ever want company, he said, real company. No expectations, just someone who sees you. Let me know. I nodded. Not a promise, not a refusal, just a maybe. That night, back in the condo, I let his words echo in the room with me. Someone who sees you, not someone who uses you, or needs you to be small so they can feel big. Not someone who only values you in the roles you perform, wife, mother, caregiver, therapist, ghost. But someone who sees you. That used to feel like a fairy tale. Now it felt possible. And that possibility was more intimate than any grand declaration. It wasn't love. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But it was something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. The next morning, the sky broke open with rain. Not the gentle kind, not the cinematic drizzle that invites warm sweaters and quiet reflection. This was the kind that roared, sheets of water crashing down like the world itself was purging something it had been holding on to too long. I watched it from the window, barefoot and wrapped in a robe, coffee in hand. And for the first time in months, the storm didn't feel like something happening to me. It felt like something I'd already lived through. It had been days since I'd seen Paul on that bench by the river, and his words hadn't left me since. If you ever want company, someone who sees you. There was a time not long ago when I would have clung to those words like a lifeline. I would have responded immediately, grateful for the attention, desperate to feel visible again after years of living like a shadow in someone else's story. But now, I didn't feel desperate. I didn't feel empty. I felt grounded. Still. And it made all the difference. I didn't reach out to him right away. Not because I wasn't grateful. Not because I didn't feel something stir. But because I needed to be sure that whatever was growing in me wasn't just a reaction to the ache David left behind. I wanted it to be clean, untangled, honest. Around noon, I received an email from my daughter. Just a few lines, a check-in. She said she was thinking about me, asked how the new place was, mentioned, almost casually, that David had tried calling her too. I stared at the words for a long time. David was circling. He was doing what he always did, testing boundaries, looking for cracks. If he couldn't get to me directly, he'd try the children. Not out of malice, but because he didn't know another way to feel relevant. He was a man who had always relied on proximity to power, and now that he had none, he was trying to borrow it wherever he could. I replied to her briefly, assured her I was doing well, told her she didn't need to manage either of us, and meant it, because this wasn't her weight to carry. Afterward, I went for a walk. The rain had calmed by then, reduced to a soft patter that slicked the sidewalks and made the air smell like renewal. I wandered without direction, letting the sound of my footsteps on wet pavement remind me that I was still here, still moving, still mine. I passed a bookstore tucked between two buildings, small and dimly lit, with ivy curling around the sign. I almost walked past it, but something about it pulled me in. Inside, it smelled of old paper and something herbal, like dried lavender. The kind of scent that makes you want to stay longer than you planned. A woman behind the counter smiled as I entered, but didn't say anything, and I was grateful for the silence. I wandered through the shelves, fingertips grazing spines like old friends. I found a book of poetry tucked away, opened it, and read a single line that landed in my chest like a prayer. You are not what was done to you. You are what you became despite it. I closed the book and held it for a long time. That was it, wasn't it? I had spent so many nights trying to understand David's betrayal, trying to make sense of Brielle's arrogance, trying to trace the cracks back to where they began. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was what I became despite it, what I chose in the aftermath. I bought the book, took it home, sat by the window and read every word as if someone had written it just for me. Later that night, I finally texted Paul. Nothing long, nothing dramatic. Just, thank you. I'd like that walk. He responded a few minutes later. Tomorrow? And for the first time in a long time, I didn't overthink it. I didn't wonder what it meant or where it was going. I just smiled. Tomorrow, I wrote. Because tomorrow didn't scare me anymore. Tomorrow felt like possibility. and for a woman who had lost everything that was never really hers to begin with. That was everything. The next morning arrived with a softness that didn't ask to be noticed. It simply was. The rain had passed, the skies had cleared, and the city moved as it always did, indifferent, pulsing, alive. But something in me had changed. The storm didn't live in my chest anymore. I wasn't bracing for the next blow, or preparing myself for the sound of David's voice on the other end of a call I'd stopped answering. I had let go of the version of me who lived in anticipation of pain. Now, I was walking into something else. I met Paul just after 10. The park wasn't crowded yet, just a few early risers with dogs and strollers, and the kind of quiet that feels too rare in a place like this. He was sitting on that same bench, the one by the river, wearing a charcoal sweater and a worn-out pair of shoes that had clearly seen more seasons than they should have. When he saw me, he stood, not rushed, not performative, just kind, steady. We walked without much conversation at first, just a shared rhythm, step by step, breath by breath, like we had done this before, in some other version of time where hearts didn't break and people didn't lie. Eventually, he asked me how I was doing. But it wasn't the kind of question people ask out of politeness. It was the kind that waits, the kind that holds space for whatever might come next. I took a moment. Then I said, "I don't feel broken anymore." His eyes met mine, and there was something in them that told me he understood more than I'd said. I went on. "It's strange. I thought the healing would look like some grand moment, a speech, a breakthrough. But it's not. It's a Tuesday morning. It's walking through the grocery store without wondering what he'd like for dinner. It's waking up and not feeling the need to check if someone else is okay before I decide how I feel." Paul nodded. "Sometimes healing just looks like peace." I smiled at that. We kept walking, talking about small things, books, music, old cities we dreamed of visiting. He told me about the little garden he'd started on his apartment balcony, how nothing really grew but he kept trying anyway. "Maybe that's the point," I said, "to keep planting things, even if they don't bloom right away." He looked at me then, not in that heavy, intense way people look when they want something from you, but gently, like he was memorizing a moment he didn't want to forget. We stopped for coffee, and as we sat across from each other at a small outdoor table, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in a long time. Laughing. Not the polite kind. Not the kind that makes someone else feel better about themselves. A real laugh. One that bubbled up from someplace honest. From a place that hadn't been touched by David. A place that was still mine. And maybe that was what struck me most. How many parts of myself I thought had been lost forever were actually just waiting, beneath the rubble, beneath the silence, beneath the years of shrinking, to be found again. Paul didn't save me. That's what made it feel real. He didn't try to fix me, didn't offer solutions or apologies for a wound he didn't cause. He simply witnessed it, sat beside it, and in doing so, made space for me to remember that I wasn't defined by what had happened to me. I was shaped by how I chose to rise from it. We walked more, talked more, and eventually, when the sun was high and the air had that late morning warmth to it, we parted ways. No promises, no pressure, just a mutual understanding. A beginning, not of something we needed to label, but of something honest, quiet, real. Back at the condo, I stood in front of the mirror, not to critique myself, not to see if I still looked like the woman David once loved, but to really see myself. And I did. The fine lines near my eyes, the faint scar on my chin from when I fell off a bike at 9, the way my shoulders sat straighter now, as if they had finally remembered they didn't have to carry the world. I saw a woman who had loved deeply, lost completely, and still found her way back to herself. That night, I made dinner just for me. One plate, one glass of wine, a candle lit not for romance, but for celebration, for survival, for the quiet dignity of starting over and making it count. I sat by the window as the city lights flickered on, one by one, and felt the quiet joy of not needing anyone else to make the moment meaningful. This was my life now. Not perfect, not without scar tissue, but mine. And as I looked out into the evening, I felt the most unexpected thing of all, something I hadn't dared to hope for in a long time. I felt free. The door clicked shut behind him, and with that sound, the past released its final grip on me. I stood there for a moment, hands still resting on the knob, not because I doubted my decision, there was no doubt anymore, but because it felt like I needed to mark the moment. The final moment. The moment when the man I had once married, once mourned, once begged in silent, unseen ways to stay, finally disappeared from my life. Not just physically, but spiritually, energetically, completely. I turned back to the kitchen and let my fingers trace the edge of the counter. Cold marble, clean, bare. There had been a time when every surface in my home had been cluttered with little pieces of David, his keys, his wallet, his coffee mug, his indifference. But here, in this space I had claimed for myself, there was nothing of him, nothing that belonged to that life, nothing that carried the stain of betrayal. It was only me now, and that was enough. I sat down at the table, the one I'd chosen alone, and ate my now lukewarm eggs in silence. A silence that once would have reminded me of everything I had lost. But now, it reminded me of everything I had reclaimed. There's something sacred about peace when it follows chaos. Something holy. Something earned. I didn't cry after David left. I didn't feel the urge to. The grief, the rage, the endless questions, they had all come and gone in the months before. Like waves that crashed and pulled me under and left me gasping. But not anymore. Now the ocean inside me was still, deep, and steady. I poured myself a second cup of coffee and stood by the window as the light shifted across the buildings. The city below moved as if nothing monumental had just happened inside this quiet condo. And maybe that was the point. Life moved on, whether you were ready or not. And now I was ready. Finally. David's words kept echoing in my head, not because they hurt, but because they didn't. You were always the one who stayed. It was meant to be an appeal, a compliment perhaps, some twisted badge of honor. But it only made me sad for the woman I used to be. The one who thought staying was the only way to prove her love. The one who held her breath for decades waiting for a man who had already left her in all the ways that counted. That version of me had disappeared the moment I handed Elise those house keys. I remembered something Paul had said to me on our walk. Sometimes healing just looks like peace. He had said it like it was the simplest truth in the world, and maybe it was. Because I didn't feel triumphant today. I didn't feel victorious. I felt quiet. And maybe that quiet was the final phase of healing. The kind that doesn't need to be shouted or shared or even named. It just settles into your bones and tells you that you survived. And not only that, you are living now. I spent the afternoon cleaning, not because the place was dirty, but because it felt like a ritual. A way to bless this space with intention, with ownership. I folded laundry while humming to myself, made the bed with fresh sheets, arranged flowers in a vase. Peonies, my favorite. Not because they reminded me of anything, but because they didn't. And then I did something I hadn't done in years. I danced. Right there in the middle of my living room, alone, barefoot, music spilling from the speakers in a language I didn't even understand, but I didn't need to. The rhythm found me anyway. I moved like I was shaking off dust, like I was exhaling years, like I was taking up space in a world that had told me over and over again to shrink. I wasn't shrinking anymore. Later that evening, I sat down with the book I had bought from the little shop, with the scent of old pages and lavender, the one that held that line I had underlined 3 times already. You are not what was done to you. You are what you became despite it. That line, those few words, they had become my compass, my proof, my redemption. The phone buzzed once more around 8:15 p.m. I didn't look. I knew it was him. Maybe he was sorry again. Maybe he wasn't. It didn't matter. I had already made peace with what he was capable of, and more importantly, what he wasn't. I placed the book down and walked to the balcony, pulling the door open and stepping into the night air. It was warm, with just a whisper of breeze. The city lights stretched out before me like stars that had fallen to the ground and decided to stay. I leaned on the railing and closed my eyes. I didn't need a man to anchor me anymore. I had become the woman I once prayed I'd find again. Whole, untethered, free. There's a quiet power in choosing yourself, in not just walking away from the fire, but in knowing you could build something from the ashes, something stronger, something truer, something that didn't need validation to be beautiful. I was no longer the woman who waited at windows. I was no longer the woman who begged to be seen. I was no longer the woman who stayed in rooms where her soul couldn't breathe. I had become the woman who left, the woman who lit the match and never looked back. And that woman, she was finally alive. The morning air smelled like freedom. It didn't have a scent, not really, not like lavender or rain or anything you could bottle and sell. But I knew it when I breathed it in. It filled my lungs without resistance, without tension. It carried no memories. It asked nothing of me. It just was. I stood barefoot on the balcony, cup of coffee warm in my hands, watching the city slowly stir. Somewhere, down below, someone was opening their cafe for the day. Someone was arguing with traffic. Someone was starting over. Someone was falling apart. And me? I was just standing here, breathing, existing, healing in the quietest, fiercest way a woman could. No theatrics, no announcements, just breathe. And a life that was mine now. I didn't know what had shifted, not precisely. Maybe it had been the moment David turned away in the hallway, his shoulders hunched beneath the weight of consequences he had never expected to carry. Maybe it had been that text from Paul. Or maybe it had been the slow realization that I no longer needed to perform my worthiness for anyone, not even myself. Whatever it was, it had happened. And I was awake in a way I hadn't been in years. The day unfolded gently. I moved through it like I was remembering a song I used to know by heart. A melody that had once filled my childhood home. The one before David, before Brielle, before the years that blurred into obligation. I listened to music. I cleaned. I wrote in a notebook just for me. Pages filled with nothing remarkable. Lists. Little poems. A dream I had about flying over a city made of glass. There was no one to critique it. No one to ask me what it meant. And I loved it for that. Around noon, I received a message from Paul. It was simple. Just, would you like to come see the garden? That small balcony garden he'd told me about. The one that refused to grow. I hesitated, not because I didn't want to go, but because I felt a sudden, surprising flutter of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not the desperate kind. Not the kind that latches onto a new face just to avoid loneliness. This was quieter, gentler, a hope that said, maybe. Maybe I could allow someone to see me, not as someone's wife or someone's failure or someone's story of survival, but just as me. So I said yes. And a few hours later, I found myself on Paul's balcony, standing among mismatched clay pots and crooked wooden stakes and the most imperfect little green sprouts I'd ever seen. It was nothing grand, nothing curated for social media, just a small patch of effort, of trying, of not giving up. I can't grow a damn thing, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. I smiled. That's not true. Something's growing. He looked at me then, eyes soft, unguarded. I used to think healing had to be visible, I said, kneeling beside one of the pots. Like you had to show the world how far you've come. Post the before and after. Make it digestible, palatable. But it's not like that. Sometimes healing is just showing up to water something that might not bloom. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But you still show up. Paul didn't speak for a moment. Then he sat beside me. I think that's why I like these plants, he said. They remind me that life doesn't always work on our timeline. Sometimes the best thing we can do is just stay open to the possibility. I looked at him and felt that flutter again. Possibility. We sat in silence, watching the wind ripple through the small, stubborn leaves. And in that silence, I felt something shift again. Not a break, not a wound reopening, but a door. One I didn't have to walk through. One I didn't have to fear. Just a door. Open. After a while, he walked me out, and I paused in the hallway before stepping into the elevator. He didn't kiss me. He didn't ask to see me again tomorrow. He just looked at me like he could see the woman I was becoming, and that was enough. That night, back at my condo, I stood in front of the mirror again. The same woman looked back at me, but not quite the same. Her eyes were clearer, her shoulders more relaxed. Her smile, not for anyone else, not for show, just soft and real and mine. I ran a bath, let the water hold me in a way no man ever had. And as I sank beneath the warmth, I let the tears come, not from grief, not from rage, but from release. I wasn't crying because I missed him. I wasn't crying because I was lost. I was crying because I had made it. Through the betrayal, through the humiliation, through the unraveling of a life I once thought was permanent. And on the other side, I had found a woman worth fighting for. Me. There was no dramatic ending, no big revenge plot, no perfect closure. Just this. Peace that didn't ask for applause. A quiet life. A slow morning. A second cup of coffee. A laugh with someone who asked for nothing but honesty. This wasn't the life I had planned, but it was the one I had chosen. And that, in the end, made all the difference. The sun was setting again, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor, the light hitting just right, soft, low, golden. I sat in the same chair I had collapsed into the day after he left. But everything was different now. Not the chair, not the room. Me. There was no music playing, no glass of wine in my hand. Just the hum of the city breathing outside my window, and me breathing in return. Slowly, steadily, freely. I wasn't waiting for the phone to ring anymore. I wasn't looking over my shoulder, wondering if Brielle would call, if David would show up, if I had missed a sign, a clue, a moment I could have changed the ending. There was no what if left in me, only what is. And what is was quiet and solid and mine. I was tired, not from sadness, but from the work of becoming, from the digging, the rebuilding, the learning how to trust the sound of my own voice again. Healing isn't glamorous. It doesn't come with applause or recognition, It's small and private and often invisible, but it is holy. I had become the kind of woman who made her own peace in a room that used to echo with someone else's silence. The photo that once hung above the mantel, our wedding portrait, was long gone. In its place was a single framed image, not of people, of the sea. I had taken it myself during a weekend alone at the coast, a horizon with no end. The couch was the same, the coffee table, even the lamp with the tiny scratch on the base. But I wasn't the same woman who sat beside them, hoping someone would come home and love her better. I had stopped asking to be chosen, because I had finally chosen myself. The mirror by the entryway caught the light as the sun dipped lower. I stood and walked toward it, not to fix my hair or check for flaws, but just to see, to acknowledge. There she was, wiser, quieter, stronger than she looked, and still standing, not untouched, but unbroken. Behind me, the kitchen was dark, save for the small flicker of a candle on the counter, the same one I had lit on the day I sold the house, jasmine and sandalwood. The scent didn't remind me of him anymore. It reminded me of the moment I took my life back. It smelled like closure and freedom. I didn't need to say it out loud. I didn't need to write it down. But as I stood there in the last golden light of day, I knew it deep in my bones. I survived the storm, and I built something beautiful from the wreckage. That is who I am now. That is what remains. We're grateful you stayed with us. For more stories of women reclaiming their voice, click on the left and subscribe to stay connected. May this be a reminder. Your story has power too.